Over there in this podcast is Nikki Thibodeau, and here is why she is awesome. She's the former senior community strategist, the first ever at Shopify, was a strong voice in their own creation of their women's employee resource group. She's in demand as well. She recently spoke at the CMX Summit and Grizzy Interactive's Community Refocus Virtual Summit. Both those conversations very focused on building community and safe spaces. And guess what we're talking about today? Hi, Nikki.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Happy to have you here. We're going to create an interesting space of conversation today as we get into this. I always find, I don't want to say manufacturing things at work. It sounds horrible, but that's kind of that's how intent works. So I'm curious how we get into this, because most people think it's done organically, but sometimes things are done much with a thought and a purpose and a plan. And I'm so curious how your brain thinks like that. But first, what's your best or worst employee experience?
Yeah, my best, so I'm a glass half full all the way human. So unless you ask me pointedly about a negative experience, you probably won't hear one. Unless it's very important to tell. So my best experience that I had at work was when I had a manager who asked me to describe what communication style worked best and how I best received feedback and how he could support me in my work. And then he actually listened and followed through. And he called me on my bullshit when I needed it, and he trusted me to get my work done. And it was just a space of incredible growth for me as an individual in the workplace, because I felt supported in the way that made sense to me. It was the first time that I didn't have to adhere to someone else's rules or change myself to fit in. And yeah, it was really a honestly life-changing experience to actually be listened to.
Isn't that heartbreaking in the sense that is, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love that. My heart's all 3 times bigger, but at the same time, why does that have to be such an anomaly versus the way the world should work when it comes to leadership?
Yeah, the interesting thing, I've seen this conversation happening very recently around managers, and how there are managers who are put in that place because they're really good at the subject matter. And then there's those who are put into place because they're really good at people leadership. And I think that there's fewer people leaders than you'll find those who have climbed the ranks due to being really good at the subject.
It's the Michael Scott problem, right? It's the Office. He was an amazing salesperson, so he rose to the level. My mom introduced this line to me, to the level of his incompetence, right? He rose to a level of, okay, now you can't go any higher because you can't do more than what we're giving you, even if you're horrible at that. Yeah. So I hear that more and more. And I think we spend way too much time focusing on thinking leadership is about delivery rather than the people side of it, when it should be both.
Absolutely. You can't have a valuable leader without both. Because otherwise, your humans can feel like they're being treated like humans, but if they don't understand the business and the scope of work, then your team's going to suffer, and then all of a sudden they don't have jobs. And so there has to be that balance of being able to be your whole self, but actually bringing work to the table as well.
This is such a nice transition into what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
So we're talking about creating safe spaces. So I guess the first question I would ask, before we get into what a safe space is, why would an organization even need one?
Yeah, I think this is the question that people ask, well, at the organizational level all the time, is why would I want to invest the time in this type of work? And what we were able to showcase, and now there's tons of studies around this, but when someone feels like they're safe to be there, then innovation is more, productivity is higher, and then people want to come to work, which is not the case everywhere. But if you feel safe to be yourself, whether that means that you woke up today and you're just not on your A game, or you woke up today and you're ready to smash it out of the park, you get to, because that space is created and it feels safe, you get to come and show up as you are. And it doesn't matter who you were yesterday, if that made sense.
So what is a safe space? because maybe a lot of organizations think they already have them,
Yeah.
or maybe they do and they don't know.
I think that like safe spaces are actually created intentionally. And I don't know that there's necessarily a longevity to a space that's unintentionally created as a safe one. It can happen for a brief moment. Like, say you have a meeting and someone felt comfortable in that space to share. It could just be a lot of like unintentional things that occurred in that meeting led to that person feeling like they had a voice. However, if that's not intentionally kept up, then there's not going to be those folks who are maybe not as vocal are going to feel comfortable speaking up. And so creating a safe space it has to be intentional. And the first way to do it is to consider who the humans are in the room. So you have to understand who you're building the table for to understand what you need to build at that table.
So that's a safe space is a place where everybody feels is a psychological safety. I'm trying to understand what we're creating first.
Yeah.
So what is a safe space, even whether it's a feeling, how does it show up? Like, what are we creating here?
The safe space, like a definition of a safe space to me is that anybody who enters it feels comfortable to show up as themselves.
Okay. Straight to the point and very personalized.
Very, very simple sounding and very hard to execute.
So how do you get to that point? You were saying that you need to do it intentionally. Mm-hmm. Well, intentional means I need to start somewhere. So where do you begin to get to that safe space?
Yeah, this is like fundamentals of building community. So when you're trying to build for a community, and we can talk about it from like a really business organizational standpoint and not necessarily feely, because it has roots in like accomplishing goals. And so when you are talking about creating a safe space, you have to understand what are you actually trying to accomplish with that safe space. Because there are a myriad of different things. Like if we're talking about employee resource groups, it's going to be different than like a team culture makeup or like an office safe space. And so if we're talking about the makeup of a team and creating a safe space within that team, the goal is likely rooted in a business goal. Like our OKRs are in acquisition. And so in order to acquire, then you start working backward. And so it's like, okay, our team's goal is purely acquisition or purely sales. And so what kind of environment do I have to create so that they can be their best selves and achieve that goal? And if you create a safe space wherein there's, encouragement to share your failures, there's encouragement to share your wins, then you're going to be able to foster an environment where your sales reps are starting to avoid mistakes other people are making because there was the safe space created to share in those losses.
Is there a difference between a virtual versus an in-person safe space?
Yes, but not necessarily in the ways that I think people inherently think. I think like it all comes back to what humans are going to be in that space. And so, for example, if we're talking about a safe space in person, you could be talking about like, can they physically get into the building comfortably? Like, are there people who they may not have a disability, but going up the stairs is like they'll be out of breath and we don't want them to feel like they're being watched. And so can you create a space where they can come and show up and feel confident? And then in virtual space, have you set the rules in a way where people understand how to be in that space? Like what's expected of them or what's not expected of them? And so being able to be really clear. One of the things, so at Shopify, we created this program called Empower Hour. It was for our women's employee resource group, and it was a bi-weekly 1-hour discussion on topics that you would normally not be able to have the space for at work. So it could be about talking about periods. It could be talking about being the daughter of an immigrant. And the way that you create a safe space when someone's coming in to talk about their deep rooted personal things that are not necessarily traditionally work related is we would start every time, it was always virtual, and we would start every meeting with the same language. It was, we are creating together a safe space. This means that we do not share outside of these four digital walls what's shared within here. And if you do want to share because you believe it will have value outside of this space, you need to get direct permission from the person who shared that. And so that we could all be sure that what happened within this space was going to be held sacred or held as like a secret, or it only happened here. And so being able to create that space and say, like, if you don't feel you're able to do that, I'm going to give you a moment to leave without shame. And there were times where someone was just like, this is intense, I'm leaving. Like, and I don't know, I never followed back up with them about like why you left, because I think you should be able to just go, this isn't for me, I'm going to leave. But through that time, people ended up immediately being like, oh, this is a space where I can actually tell you about the struggles that I have. This is that space for it. And it created this beautiful ability to have conversations with folks about topics that I literally, like being a daughter of an immigrant is not something that I relate to, but I was able to be in a space with folks having that conversation, and they could feel safe having those conversations.
I love the bubble of empathy. I love that even they're not experiences, they're other people's experiences that you can help with that connection. So that makes me think, okay, you're in this, you've created this community, perfect example of it. What were the benefits to those individuals? Did you hear back? Like, what were the aha moments of, oh, we're almost creating our own subculture here?
The biggest thing for me was belonging. It was understanding that you are not the only person that this happens to. And when you recognize that you're not the only one, it actually gives you permission to use your voice more, because you understand that when you say something that maybe you don't hear in the ether, that there's probably going to be someone who goes, I see myself in that. Or, oh yeah, I'll support that because that happens to me too. And how that benefits the workplace is that people will now actually speak up when they don't agree with something, or it'll give people the ability to create new ideas, because they're not going to be like, oh, someone's going to tell me that I'm an idiot. Someone's going to be like, oh, wait, yes, and instead of no, thank you.
How does culture and as I mentioned, subcultures get in the way of you being able to create these safe spaces?
I think it's like assumptions. So there are a lot of times where, so for those who can't see me, I am a white cis woman. And what ends up happening when you're trying to create spaces wherein there are intersectionalities or those subcultures, there's tons of trauma that's experienced by those cultures. And so there's a hesitancy to allow a white woman into that space, or to allow someone, or to believe that I'm coming from a place where I can hold space for you. And so where those get in the way is this assumed, and like for sake of protection, there's this assumed inability to share because of either your experience or your perception of the person you're talking to. And so one of the biggest ways is othering yourself and thinking that I can only share within this certain subculture, and it can't traverse a wall.
I'm thinking of a lot of leaders that may not know how to even dip their toe in, may even not know that they are not, like, their self-awareness is shit, or their
Right.
situational awareness is crap. And they're basically ignorant to the fact that they may not be creating safe space. How do you break that down?
Yeah, so you had mentioned that CMX talk that I did about building safe spaces. And the biggest thing, I talk about like 3 steps. And we all know steps, they have like 1,000 steps underneath them. But the first step is acknowledge. And what that looks like is it's okay to be like unaware of the current space. And it's okay that like I think one of the hardest things is when you've been say you've been a manager of the same team for 10 years and you're like, well, if I were to try and create something different, is that saying that the last 10 years I've spent I've been doing it wrong? And so then it often comes to this point where people are hesitant for change because they don't want to negate the work that came previous. But to what I say to that is that like continuous growth is continuous for a reason because the world changes around us and we're allowed today to have a differing opinion on something that we had yesterday because of something we've learned. And if we can be the types of humans in these spaces that can come and take a look and be like, I need a fresh perspective. I need to acknowledge what is and what should be or what I'm trying to get to and move forward. And so, for example, we were coming back to being that women's employee resource group. I had created Empower Hour, and it became our flagship program, which was so great. But then we were including folks out who weren't just women. We were including folks within the gender, like outside of the gender binary. And what ended up happening was those folks felt safe within that employee resource group. But the reality was is that we weren't building any other resources for those individuals. And so we came a time where we had to acknowledge that we had been unintentionally including a group of folks who then felt supported by something that was not actually built for them. And so we had to come to this spot where it was like, I could have crumbled and been like, oh, I've been doing this all wrong. But what I recognized was I've now learned something that means that I have a differing opinion today than what I had yesterday, and I now need to move forward. So the acknowledgement was we now have 2 separate groups who need support. And we need to decide, are we going to change the makeup of the Women's Employee Resource Group and become something like maybe a gender minority resource group? Or are we going to go back to our roots and be solely for women? And so within that acknowledgement, you go back to your community or you go back to your team and you say, hey, this is what I've taken a look at the team makeup and this is what I've deduced. Am I right? Am I wrong? And then you just sit back and you listen and you create spaces. One of the biggest things I find that is done in error by leaders is that they believe that there's only one way to submit feedback. It's like, oh, we'll have a meeting. I'll give you some time to think about it, and we'll all come together and have a meeting and talk about it. But there's going to be, when we're talking about building more safe spaces, there's going to be folks who have not been heard for a really long time. And you're going to need to figure out, how do I get their voices heard? And so having different ways of people submitting either anonymous feedback or just written feedback, and having the ability to have like maybe a one-on-one or a group discussion, you're going to want to have the ability to create the space to listen and figure out what it is that your team or your community want. And so we've got step 1, acknowledge. Step 2 is listen. And then at the end of the process, you're going to have to make a decision. And you're going to have to decide, okay, well, what are we going to do now to move forward? And when I was referencing back to this Women's Employee Resource Group, what we did was we recognized that through a lot of things, there's the fact that we were only a Women's Employee Resource Group and only had resources for women. There was the fact that through our education and talking to those outside the gender binary, realizing that there's a lot of spaces that were initially created for women that are actually traumatic for folks outside the gender binary. And so a space for folks outside the gender binary cannot be created by women. And so our decision at the end of the day was to go back, be a women's ERG, and then move forward by helping them create a net new space. And so once you've made your decision, step 3 is inform. And the reality of Inform is that it's probably one of the most uncomfortable steps, because there's never ever going to be a world where you've pleased everybody. And so there's going to be, and the Inform step is the change. It's the ask of your team. It's the ask of your community to come on this journey of change with you. And change is inherently uncomfortable. And so creation of safe space means that like people have had their ability to have a voice, but you've also taken a big leap, and you're going to lose some people along the way. But what ends up happening is you create this space where people can then innovate and be themselves and grow. And the people who come along the journey with you are the ones that you're creating that space for. And it's okay that you didn't create a space for everyone. I think that's impossible.
But there will be a lot of people that will flag going, well, it's not being inclusive then. If everybody can't be a part of it or everybody feels comfortable in it, then it is inclusive. But you're saying by listening, and maybe there are other safe spaces for them that would show up differently for them.
There's this really great book by Priya Parker called The Art of the Gathering. And in it, she talks about creating a dinner party. And at that dinner party, you have all of your friends. And so say you are a parent and you have your parent friends. And then you have another really good friend, but they don't have kids. And they don't like kids, they hate them. And but they're like a really good human. And so you invite them to that dinner party. But if you hadn't set the intention, like if the intention of that dinner party was to have a space where parents could talk to each other, being inclusive of someone, regardless of their intent, actually takes away from the experience of those who need that space. And so by being exclusive, it's actually a mechanism of inclusion and deeper inclusion.
So you've acknowledged, you've listened, you've informed, you're creating a safe space, you've set the dinner table, as it were, in the rules and not rules. How do you keep this going? How do you maintain a safe space over? Because I'm assuming you don't just want to create it and let it die in a heartbeat. This is something you want to establish over time. So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so within the space of you like figuring out what it is that you're trying to achieve, you're going to be able to measure against that. And sometimes it is actual metrics, like you can survey your team or survey your community and figure out, am I doing the thing? But a lot of time it's just like, is this working? Are we, like, if you're coming back to that sales team analogy, are we achieving our goals? Are we actually getting the sales output we need to? And if you're not, then you come back and you go back to acknowledge, like you assess the situation, you acknowledge what is, and then you figure out what you need to change. And so it's always going to be constant, because like referencing back to the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about how there can be unintentionally safe spaces. But if you don't continue nurturing that safe space or doing things intentionally, then it's just not going to maintain that space.
Now, do you feel, especially as somebody who created a community within a larger organization, that it is success just basically building a tons of little subculture safe spaces that eventually join up, bubble together into a big, like, is it a culture or is it a culture? Like, you know what I mean? Is safe spaces, are you just building a lot of them to build a big one, or is that not how this works?
No, I think like you don't build a safe space just to build a safe space. You build a safe space out of a need. And so that could mean that you have a lot of them. Like in a big organization like Shopify, we had, I think it was 7 or 8 employee resource groups. And then within those employee resource groups, you have intersectionality. So for example, we were a women's employee resource group, but we had Indigenous women or gay women. And so it's like you have all those intersectionalities, but it isn't on the organization necessarily to identify what spaces need to be created. It's my belief that it's you as an individual you need to create an organization where any individual can say, I don't feel represented or I don't feel safe. And there's a mechanism to solve that. but it's not your responsibility as an organization to identify necessarily what safe spaces need to be created.
So are you saying it's the responsibility of not executive, but rather the management supervisors to do this? I'm just trying to wonder where the responsibility lies.
I think that like the responsibility of creating a culture where people can speak up and speak out is important at the executive level. But I think that oftentimes as individuals, we feel like someone should recognize us, like see us. Everybody wants to be seen and recognized. But in the reality, like I remember part of my background is in helping small business entrepreneurs. And one of the biggest lessons that often they learn is that they have to nominate themselves for awards. Or they have to submit themselves for, like if they have a product-based business, they have to submit themselves to be on that top 10 list. The editor is not going out and actually finding 10 things. It's a curated list from someone who submitted. And so I think we often want, like we really deep down want to be recognized in something built for us, but the onus is on us to create what it is that we want. And regardless of whether or not you're capable of actually creating that safe space, it's on you as the individual, not even a manager or a supervisor, but the individual employee to recognize that you're not supported in a way and then ask for that to be supported.
What are I'm thinking of an audit here because there are some people that might think, okay, I don't even know if I have safe space. I don't know where the subcultures of these safe spaces even exist. What are some of the red flags people should be looking for that think, you know what, you need to be focusing on this?
I think like people, humans, as they show up to work, if you find that they are quiet all the time or they don't participate or they're not proactively asking questions, if you're always having to chase them and direct where your team's going, I think you can understand you don't have a safe space. Because if people, regardless of whether or not their ideas are good, it's important that they have the space to be able to ask or say like, hey, you know what, I was thinking the other day about maybe our team should be doing this. And then if you don't have anybody in your team coming up to you and saying, hey, I was wondering what you think about this new direction or this way to do my job. And you just have someone going, what do you think? What do you want me to be doing? Then that's a really big indication that they don't feel comfortable, that you're going to be able to be receptive of maybe them suggesting that they do something different that you haven't suggested.
What are the benefits to diversity, equity, inclusion? You mentioned belonging earlier, but you need the DEI first before we can get into the belonging component. So where's the intersection with that intent? Because that's a huger part of the conversation. I hear psychological safety a lot.
Yeah.
I hear diversity, equity, inclusion a lot, but you don't hear safe spaces as much. Are we kind of talking about the same thing?
It's absolutely the same thing. One of the things about like diversity, equity, and inclusion, like, so Shopify is obviously a place that plays within capitalism, right? Like it's like a harbinger of capitalism. And so if we talk about building a product for the masses aren't just white people. And so if you have just white people at the table, you're going to be missing a huge market. So if we talk about it in a capitalistic sense, the importance of including others in the conversation is that you're then going to have diversity of thought and be able to sell the product to more folks. And like, we can just put it to numbers. But if you really think about it from a human level, then you think about it as like, again, that diversity of thought. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're selling the product to African Americans, and so you need an African American on your team, but it can mean that that person has had a lived experience, is going to add color. That's maybe a bad choice of words, but add color to the conversation or add color to the thought process of how you go about creating a new product or creating a new service. And so if we continuously have the same voices in the room, then we're just never going to innovate.
I had some really great conversations on other episodes, one about accessibility, one about neurodiversity. And those are also voices that absolutely need to be, and I'm not saying you didn't highlight that. I'm just saying that it is, when people think diversity,
Yeah.
you have to think beyond color of skin for a lot of organizations, because they'll think they're doing a good job if they can visibly see diversity, rather than these people that are needing to be heard, wanting to be heard, but aren't obvious.
Yeah. And one of the big things, like when we talk about building safe spaces, when we talk about events, for example, so say you're creating an event where someone can come and participate, and an event could be a meeting, and you want to create a space where people feel like they can have their voice heard. Well, they're touching on neurodivergencies. It's not now just, can someone physically access the space? It's, can someone actually engage in a way that feels comfortable for them? So I bet your episode on neurodivergency goes into it in more detail, but it's could be as easy as like sending forward your slide deck ahead of time, so someone had the chance to be able to read it before coming and getting the fuller depth from your conversation. It's creating accessible resources where someone can create the safe space for themselves, or create a space where they can thrive. It's not always just like, can they physically make it to that room?
Yeah, let's paint that picture. Imagine you're a neurodiverse person that needs to process differently than maybe what the leader, quote unquote, leader is used to. And then not getting that agenda ahead of time, not getting that slide deck ahead of time. And then going, oh, by the way, we got to do a meeting right now. Ready, go, talk about this. How safe would you feel if it feels almost like an ambush, or you don't have the information ahead of time to make or put your best foot forward? I can see other leaders going, hey, we need to meet in 15 minutes. Are you ready? How safe do I feel when I don't even know what the meeting's about? And I feel like I'm being ambushed, not led.
Exactly.
That hurts my heart.
Absolutely. And that comes back down to, like, remember at the beginning you asked me what is one of my best employee experiences. And it was that my boss asked me, how can I help you best show up? And it really comes down to, as a leader, have you created a safe enough space on your team where your individuals can say, I need a day's notice for a meeting, or I need to meet in the afternoon because I'm a bitch in the mornings. Like, what's the safest space for them? Or I need the minutes of the meeting prior to meeting with you. Or I have a friend who their team works really fast. And so those last minute meetings happen all of the time. And it may sound funny, but like, especially in this economy, if their boss is going to say, we need to meet in 15 minutes, they have to say, your job is safe. It's about the work. Like, and it's repetitive, but it's just like, that's their concern, is I'm going to be laid off right now, because layoffs are happening everywhere. And so it's like, what do I need to give as a lead? What do I need to give my team, which is just an extra line of text? Like, your job is safe. We're just talking about the work. But that means you can meet in 15 minutes. It's being a human first who loves getting the job done.
Nikki, what is one simple action people can do right now to improve their relationships at work?
Listen more. But like, listen to understand, not to reply or have an opinion. That's like, I think, a lost art.
That there is Nikki Thibodeau. Sorry. See, I'm gonna get good. I'll dance around it. Lolacher. Thibodeau. And here is why, ladies and gentlemen, that was Nikki Thibodeau. She's a former senior community strategist. First ever, we should really stress that, first ever over at Shopify. She was a strong voice in their creation of the Women's Employee Resource Group, which she was amazingly explaining today. Thank you so much, Nikki, for being a part of this.
Thank you.